Professor Metcalf, carbon pricing is often discussed under the aspects of macroeconomics. If it is implemented on a larger scale, who would be the winner of this policy and who would be the loser?
You've got winners and losers along the dimension of the income distribution. Low-income households spend a higher fraction of their income on energy-related consumption, so they will bear a disproportionate burden of carbon pricing. So you would want to think about policies that address the regressive nature of a carbon price. Then you have differences across sectors in industry. You've got energy-intensive sectors. You've got power production from coal, from natural gas. You have also energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors who are facing trade competition. Those would be potentially impacted.
What are the industry impacts of carbon pricing?
If you look at the emissions of the aluminum sector, cement, fertilizer sector, these are sectors where they are responsible for something on the order of less than 5% of the value of shipments in the United States, but they're responsible for the bulk of emissions within the manufacturing sector. So it's a problem of a concentrated impact on these few sectors, and so you would need policies. You may want policies to address concerns in those sectors.
What can be done to soften the impact of carbon pricing on the international competitiveness of companies?
So that's a great question. The first response I would make is that we need to really step back and ask whether we need to do anything. There has been a great deal of work done on to the extent to which leakage is a concern, leakage being the idea that if we put a carbon price in place in the European Union, then carbon-intensive industries will leave the EU and go relocate to China or India, and so we end up not reducing emissions, but simply moving the locus of emissions. So the first question is leakage a significant problem? And I think the jury is still out on that. Now, politically, regardless of whether leakage is a problem or not, the reality is that there will be political pressure to address the perceived or real competitiveness concerns. And you've got a number of approaches that you could take. I think the approach that I favor is to identify a very narrow group of sectors that are disproportionately impacted or potentially impacted, and provide a very targeted, very limited credit on their corporate income tax for their emissions that is tied to their production levels. So the goal here is to keep the carbon price signal as clear as possible.
Should there be a special treatment for energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors then?
Speaking as an economist, whether there should be some sort of special treatment for the energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors, I think the jury's out whether we need it. Now, politically, we may need to do it in order to get, at least in the United States, we may need it in order to get legislation passed. The situation may be different in the European Union.
And in regards to the poorest part of population, what could be done to avoid that they have to pay the relatively largest price for reducing emissions?
I think there are a number of possibilities. You can do a lump sum energy security check or a carbon rebate check to all households. This is one approach that's highly progressive and so offsets the regressivity of the tax. You could use it to lower payroll taxes, which is the single largest tax that poor working households face. To address the concerns of low-income households, there are a number of ways in which you can return some of the revenue to those households in ways that will offset the carbon price and, in fact, potentially make them better off.
Could you also tell us what is the problem with payroll rate tax reduction?
So from a distributional perspective, you can design a payroll tax, carbon tax reform with a payroll tax that is actually fair across the income distribution. Now, the problem with it is that you're trading, well, it's not a problem, it's just that it's the classic it's the classic trade-off that economists and politicians have to deal with, which is that you get the least bang for the buck in terms of using the revenue to spark greater economic growth by using the revenue to lower the payroll tax than if you take the revenue and use it to lower taxes on capital income. We'll get more growth impacts. We'll get larger economic growth impacts from lowering taxes on corporate income, capital taxes, than if we lower payroll taxes. But you get a more progressive outcome by lowering payroll taxes. Now, if you lower payroll taxes, you do have to take into account that there is a section of the population that's not working, so you need to combine that with some sort of benefit relief to the elderly who are not working and receiving pension payments.
To what extent could corporate income taxation be reduced?
So the calculations I do in my paper that I spoke about at this conference, could the carbon tax revenue, which is about $100 billion a year with a $20 per ton carbon tax, that revenue would be sufficient to reduce the corporate income tax by about 8 percentage points, which means lowering the corporate income tax in the United States from 35% to 27%, which is very close to the stated goal of both President Obama as well as many members of Congress who would like to see the corporate income tax lowered to 25%. A carbon tax reform combined with corporate income tax reform could actually buy you the reductions that both parties in the United States would like to see happen.
How would you assess the so-called co-benefits of carbon pricing, for example in China?
If I put on my theoretical hat of a pure theoretical economist who is concerned about doing everything with not ideological, with economic purity, I'd say every externality, every piece of pollution should have its own tax. I think can get a lot of political momentum from the co-benefits idea, particularly in China. China is undergoing unbelievable pollution, and a carbon tax would reduce coal consumption, which then does lead to these potentially significant decreases in particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, all these pollutants which contribute enormously to the urban smog that China suffers from. So I think there's a real benefit from thinking about these co-benefits. And I think the fact of the matter is that China is moving on carbon emissions to a great extent based on these co-benefits and based on their real concerns with environmental quality in the cities.